Some inheritances come as blessings disguised as curses. Others simply come when a man needs them most. Bill Thompson looked at the property that now belonged to him through the dust dancing in the dry Arizona air. 32 acres of barren land, a house that seemed to sigh with every gust of wind, and a barn that tilted to the west as if to escape the merciless sun. Uncle Henry had left it for him, along with a simple letter. "It's yours now, Bill. Do something better than I did." The lawyer in Phoenix had been clear. The property wasn't worth even the back taxes Bill would have to pay. The wind carried the smell of mugwort and parched earth as he walked the grounds for the first time. At his feet, a German shepherd dog with golden coats sniffed every square meter with the dedication of a detective. Rex had been Bill's companion for the past 5 years, since he found the injured animal on the side of a road in New Mexico. Now far from the small carpentry jobs that barely paid rent in Tucson, Bill pinned his last hopes on this forgotten land. The house creaked as he pushed open the main door. The interior revealed decades of neglect. Furniture covered in dusty sheets, windows dulled by dirt, and a heavy silence that seemed to hold secrets. Bill walked through the empty rooms, his footsteps echoing off the worn wooden floor. In the kitchen, he found a manual water pump that was still working, jagged gushes filling a basin of enameled iron. Rex remained outside, restless. The animal sniffed the air insistently, its erect ears picking up sounds Bill couldn't hear. Something in the dog's posture caught the man's attention. Rex knew danger when he sensed, and he knew opportunity too. The barn stood 50 yards from the house, its leaning structure giving it the appearance of something about to collapse. Bill approached slowly, noticing how Rex was shaking more with each step. The wooden planks were discolored by time, some loose swaying in the constant wind that swept through the property. A rusty chain held the double doors together, but the lock had long since yielded to heat and oxidation. As Bill pushed away the heavy wooden doors, a gust of warm, odor-laden air escaped from the gloomy interior. Rex barked once, a low, guttural sound that made the hairs on Bill's arms stand on end. The interior of the barn was steeped in deep shadows, interrupted only by the beams of sunlight seeping through the cracks in the walls and ceiling. Bill took a flashlight from his pocket and scanned the space with the beam of yellowish light. Bales of hay stacked to the ceiling formed narrow corridors through the barn. Rusty farm tools hung from the walls, sickles, hoes, chains, and equipment he couldn't identify. The dirt floor showed the marks of wagon wheels and horses' hooves, ghosts of a time when this place was bustling with activity. Rex advanced through the barn with determination, sniffing every corner as if looking for something specific. The dog stood before a pile of hay bales at the back of the building, scratching at the earth with his front paws and emitting low sounds of excitement. Bill followed the animal, the light of the flashlight revealing that the bales were arranged strangely, as if someone had purposely placed them there to hide something. Bill's heart raced as he began to lift the burdens. They were heavy and dry, crumbling in his hands as he moved them. Rex continued to sniff and scratch, growing more agitated by the minute. When Bill removed the last bale, the light from the flashlight illuminated an opening in the floor, an entrance to what appeared to be an underground basement or storage room that no one had mentioned in the property's documentation. The opening was covered with heavy wooden planks, held together by wrought iron hinges that still moved with surprising ease for their age. Bill hesitated for a moment, his hand on the iron handle. Rex looked at him expectantly, his tail flapping lightly against the dirt floor. When Bill opened the trapdoor, a stream of cold air rose from the dark hole, bringing with it a sweet, metallic odor that he couldn't identify. The light from the flashlight wasn't strong enough to fully penetrate the darkness below, but he could see the first few steps of a wooden staircase descending into the depths. Rex descended first, disappearing into the darkness with the confidence of one who knows every shadow. Bill followed him slowly, testing each step before supporting all his weight. The air grew colder and denser with each step, and soon he found himself in an underground chamber dug into the solid earth. The lantern revealed a surprisingly large space. a rectangular room approximately 6 meters long by 4 meters wide. The walls were reinforced with wooden planks, and the floor was covered with large stone slabs arranged with precision. But it wasn't the construction that made Bill take a step back. It was what was stored there. Rows of wooden barrels lined the walls, each marked with symbols that looked like dates and starters. Stacked metal boxes formed small mountains in the corners of the room. And in the center, on a makeshift table made of boards and easels, was something that made Bill's blood run cold in his veins. Canvas bags, dozens of them, arranged in careful piles. When Bill opened the first one with trembling hands, the light of the flashlight revealed its contents, gold and silver coins, some so old that the faces and symbols were almost erased by time. The second bag contained banknotes, some crisp and new, others yellowed and fragile. Rex sniffed every corner of the chamber, occasionally stopping to look at Bill as if waiting for some kind of confirmation. The man continued to open bags and boxes, revealing more gold, more money, jewelry, pocket watches, rings, and necklaces. An entire fortune was hidden under that seemingly worthless barn, but along with the discovery came a sense of unease that Bill couldn't ignore. That didn't seem like ordinary savings or even a hidden inheritance. The meticulous organization, the symbols on the barrels, the secret location, everything suggested something darker. Some of the coins had markings he recognized from history books about the Old West. Mint markings that had been stolen decades ago. The temperature in the underground chamber remained constant, but Bill felt cold sweat running down his back. Rex had found something else at the back of the room, a smaller, elaborately carved wooden box. When Bill opened it, he found carefully preserved documents, maps, letters, lists of names and dates, all handwritten in faded ink. One of the documents caught his attention immediately. It was a letter addressed to Henry Thompson, his uncle, dated 20 years ago. The signature at the end made Bill's stomach turn. Samuel Blackwood. That name he knew. Everyone in Arizona knew it. Blackwood had been the leader of one of the territory's most notorious robber gangs, responsible for bank and train robberies that made national headlines. Officially, he had died in a shootout with sheriffs in 1895. The letter was brief but revealing. Henry, as we agreed, half stays with you for the help. The rest is where it has always been. If something happens to me, do what you think is best. But remember, they'll never stop looking. Bill sat heavily on one of the metal boxes, the flashlight shaking in his hand. His uncle Henry, the quiet man who raised cattle and was never involved in trouble, had been Samuel Blackwood's partner. The worthless farm was actually the hideout of decades of robberies committed by the West's most wanted gang. Rex walked over and leaned his muzzle against Bill's leg, as if sensing the man's emotional turmoil. Outside, the wind continued to whistle through the cracks of the barn, but in the underground chamber, a heavy silence reigned, laden with decisions that needed to be made. Bill looked around once more, mentally calculating the value of what he was seeing. It was enough money to buy a prosperous farm, raise cattle, build a dignified life. It was also blood-stained money, the result of crimes that had terrorized the territory for years. And if the letter was right, there were people who were still looking for that treasure. The man turned off the flashlight for a moment, letting complete darkness take over the camera. In the absence of the light, she could hear her own breathing, Rex's gentle movements, and far away, the lingering sound of the desert wind. When he relit the lantern, his decision was not yet made, but one thing was certain. His life had changed forever that day. Climbing back to the surface would be easy. To pretend that he had never discovered that chamber would be impossible. Rex looked at him expectantly, as if the animal knew that this moment would define not only Bill's future, but the fate of all the secrets buried beneath the barren Arizona land. Bill climbed from the underground chamber with his legs shaking, not from the physical exertion, but from the weight of the discoveries he carried in his mind. Rex emerged behind him, sniffing the air of the barn as if something had changed since they descended. The man carefully closed the trapdoor and replaced the hay bales exactly as they were, their movements automatic as he processed the magnitude of what he had just found. The sunlight filtered through the cracks in the barn looked different now, charged with a golden quality that didn't exist before. Bill walked over to the double doors and looked out, taking in the barren landscape that stretched to the distant mountains. Everything looked the same parched earth, the same thorny bushes, the same unforgiving sky. But he knew that nothing would ever be the same again. Rex ran to the house and back, agitated, as if he wanted to tell someone about the discovery. The dog had this uncanny ability to sense when life was about to change. Bill remembered how Rex had acted the same way the night before he lost his job at the sawmill in Tucson, restless and alert to unseen dangers. The man spent the rest of the afternoon exploring the rest of the property, but his mind kept drifting back to the underground chamber. He found an artesian well that still worked, pumping fresh water from deep within the earth. There were remains of corrals and fences that could be repaired with labor and materials. The land, though barren, showed signs that it could sustain cattle if it was worked properly. When the sun began to tilt westward, painting the sky orange and red, Bill made a decision. He needed to know more about his Uncle Henry and Samuel Blackwood. He needed to understand exactly what he had gotten himself into before deciding what to do with his discovery. The next morning, Bill drove his old pickup to the nearest town, Cedar Ridge, leaving Rex to guard the property. The town was small, little more than a main street lined with low brick and wood buildings. A church, a post office, a general market, and 2 taverns completed the scene. It was the kind of place where everyone knew everyone and where secrets were bargaining chips. Bill found what he was looking for in the general market. The owner, an elderly man named Pete Garrison, knew the history of the area like no one else. When Bill mentioned that he had inherited the estate from Henry Thompson, Pete's eyes narrowed slightly. Pete said that Henry Thompson had arrived in the region in the late 1890s, buying the land for a price too low for a property of that size. He raised a few heads of cattle, but never seemed to put much effort into making the farm prosper. He was a quiet man who went to the city only once a month to buy supplies, always paying in cash. When Bill asked about Samuel Blackwood, Pete was visibly uncomfortable. He looked around to make sure no one was listening before he spoke. Blackwood and his gang had terrorized the region for nearly a decade, robbing banks, trains, and stagecoaches. But there was something odd about the crimes. They always seemed to know exactly when and where to strike, as if they had inside information. The most intriguing thing was that after the robberies, the money and gold simply disappeared. The law chased Blackwood and his men throughout the land, but never found more than a few coins in the hiding places. It was as if the gang had found the perfect way to make large amounts of wealth just disappear. Pete mentioned that Blackwood was rumored to have a silent partner, someone respectable who provided information and helped hide the proceeds of the thefts. But they were only rumors, whispered in taverns by drunken men. There was never any evidence. Bill thanked him for the information and bought supplies for a few days. On the way out of town, he stopped at the small local cemetery. It didn't take long to find Henry Thompson's tombstone, a simple stone with only name and dates. He died 2 years ago at the age of 73. The grave was well cared for, which meant that someone was still visiting the site. As he stood before the tombstone, Bill heard footsteps on the dry land behind him. He turned to find a middle-aged woman, gray hair tied back in a simple bun, wearing a faded blue dress. She carried wildflowers in her hand. The woman introduced herself as Sarah Mitchell, the owner of the boarding house in Cedar Ridge. She had come to visit Henry's grave every month since he died. When Bill explained who he was, Sarah invited him to her boarding house for coffee. Sarah revealed details about Henry Thompson that Pete hadn't mentioned. Henry used to dine at his boarding house once a week, always alone, always polite and reserved. He never talked about his past, but Sarah noticed things. His hands showed calluses of someone who had worked hard all his life, but he also had scars that looked like those of gunshot or stab wounds. She said that Henry had nightmares. The few times she stayed to sleep in the boarding house during storms, she heard him screaming in the middle of the night, speaking names she didn't recognize and asking forgiveness for things she never specified. In the morning, he always looked embarrassed and apologized for the noise. Sarah also mentioned something that made Bill's heart race. About 6 months before he died, Henry had sought out the local church priest, Father Michael, for a confession. Whatever Henry had confessed had left the priest visibly shaken for weeks. Father Miguel never spoke about it, of course, but Sarah noticed that he began to include special prayers for the redemption of sins at Sunday Masses. Bill thanked Sarah for the information and drove back to the farm as the sun set on the horizon. Rex greeted him enthusiastically, barking and running in circles around the pickup. Everything seemed normal on the property, but Bill noticed something that made him stop. There were boot footprints on the dusty ground near the barn, footprints that were definitely not his. The man examined the marks carefully. They were cowboy boots, large size, with a distinctive pattern on the sole. The footprints came from the direction of the back road that ran west of the property, circled the barn a few times, and then headed back in the same direction. Whoever had been there had come and gone on foot, which meant that he had probably parked far away so as not to be seen. Rex sniffed the footprints with interest, emitting a low growl that indicated he didn't like the scent of the invader. Bill checked the barn carefully. The hay bales were just as he had left them. The trapdoor remained hidden, but someone had been there, looking for something. That night, Bill decided to sleep in the barn instead of in the house. He spread a sleeping bag among the hay bales, positioning himself where he could see both the main doors and the area where the trapdoor was hidden. Rex settled at his feet, alert to any sound or movement. Around midnight, Rex raised his head and emitted a barely audible growl. Bill held his breath, all his muscles tense. Outside the barn, he could hear the soft sound of footsteps on dry land, trying to move quietly but not being able to avoid the occasional sound of pebbles being stepped on. The footprints stopped in front of the barn doors. Bill could hear heavy breathing and the metallic sound of something being handled, probably a gun. After a few minutes that seemed like hours, the footsteps moved away, circling the barn slowly. Bill remained motionless until the sounds completely disappeared in the direction of the back road. Only then did he allow his muscles to relax. But he couldn't go back to sleep. Someone knew about the farm, about the barn, maybe even about the underground chamber. Blackwood's letter had mentioned that they would never stop looking. At dawn, Bill made a decision that would change everything. He couldn't just ignore the hidden fortune, but he also couldn't pretend he was safe. He needed to know who was looking for Blackwood's treasure and what they were willing to do to find it. But first, he needed to better understand what exactly he had inherited. He descended again into the underground chamber, this time with a more powerful flashlight and renewed determination. Rex followed him, as curious as the first time. Bill began to examine the documents more carefully, looking for clues about the extent of Blackwood's operation and the role of his Uncle Henry. What he found was even more disturbing than he had imagined. Henry Thompson wasn't just a passive partner, he was the mastermind behind many of the gang's most audacious robberies. The documents revealed an elaborate system of information on gold shipments, train schedules, and stagecoach routes. Henry had used his respectable position in the community to gather information and plan the crimes. In return, he received a generous percentage of the profits, which he carefully hid on his seemingly worthless farm. But there was something else in the documents, something that made Bill's blood run cold, a list of names, dates, and amounts. It was a detailed record of payments made to informants, corrupt sheriffs, and local politicians. Blackwood's system was much broader than anyone had imagined, involving respectable people throughout the region. And at the bottom of the list spelled in different ink and newer handwriting, was a name Bill recognized: Pete Garrison, the owner of the General Market in Cedar Ridge. Rex began to growl again, but this time it wasn't because of outside sounds. The dog was staring blankly at a corner of the chamber that Bill hadn't yet fully explored. When he pointed his flashlight in that direction, he saw something that had gone unnoticed before: a second, smaller passage, partially hidden by a canvas curtain. Bill pulled back the curtain and found another tunnel, this one dug into the solid rock and extending in an unknown direction. The air coming from the passage was cold and carried a metallic odor that resembled dried blood. Rex adamantly refused to enter the tunnel, standing at the entrance and making low sounds of discomfort. On the floor of the passageway, Bill found more footprints, the same boots he had seen outside the barn. Someone had been there recently, exploring the tunnels that stretched under his property. But where did these passages lead? And what else was hidden in the depths of the earth? Bill looked at Rex, who was still reluctant to move forward. The dog had shown an unerring instinct so far, and if he was scared of something in the tunnel, perhaps there was a good reason for it. But Bill knew he couldn't just ignore the passage. Whatever was hidden at the end of that tunnel was part of the legacy he had inherited from his Uncle Henry. With a deep breath, Bill began to move through the narrow passageway, the flashlight shaking slightly in his hand. Rex stood at the entrance to the main chamber, his eyes glowing in the darkness as he watched his owner disappear into the unknown depths of the earth. The tunnel stretched approximately 50 meters through the solid rock, ending in a second chamber, smaller than the first. Bill emerged from the passage with heavy breathing, not only from the physical exertion, but from the discovery that awaited him. The flashlight revealed a scene that explained why Rex had refused to move forward. Human skeletons lay strewn across the rocky floor, some still wearing rags of once fashionable clothing. Withered leather wallets and rusty pocket watches indicated that these had been prosperous people. Bill counted 7 bodies, all positioned in a way that suggested violent and sudden death. Handgun bullets scattered on the floor confirmed his darkest suspicions. In the center of the chamber, a rough stone table supported documents protected by a metal box. Bill opened the box with trembling hands and found Samuel Blackwood's personal diary. The yellowed pages told a story of betrayal that made her stomach turn. Those skeletons weren't random victims. They were Blackwood's gang members themselves. The diary revealed that Blackwood had discovered that some of his men were planning to betray him, taking the accumulated treasure and abandoning it to face the approaching justice alone. Instead of confronting them directly, Henry Thompson had suggested a final meeting in the secret chamber to divide everything equally before they parted ways for good. The trap had worked perfectly. Blackwood and Henry had sealed the only exit from the second chamber, leaving the traitors to slowly die in the darkness. The diary described how the two men listened to the screams and pleas for hours until silence finally came. Henry had argued that it was justice. Men who cheat on their partners deserve the fate they chose. But the last diary entry, written in shaky handwriting and stained with what looked like tears, showed that Blackwood had begun to question his choices. He wrote about nightmares, about the faces of the dead men who visited him every night. Guilt was eating away at his sanity, and he knew his days were numbered, not by the law, but by the weight of his own actions. Bill closed the journal and looked again at the skeletons. These men had died for greed, betrayed for even greater greed. His Uncle Henry had been not only Blackwood's partner, but perhaps the crueler of the two. The farm he had inherited was not just a cache of stolen riches, it was a graveyard of secrets buried decades ago. The sound of footsteps echoing through the tunnel made Bill freeze. Someone had entered the first chamber and was walking towards it. The light of a second lantern began to approach through the narrow passage. Bill put out his own flashlight and hid behind the stone table, his heart beating so hard he feared the sound would give it away. A figure emerged from the tunnel, a tall, broad-shouldered man wearing cowboy boots and a wide-brimmed hat that shaded his face. When he raised his flashlight to examine the chamber, Bill recognized the profile. It was Pete Garrison, the owner of the General Market. The man who had been so solicitous in providing information about Henry Thompson and Samuel Blackwood. Pete walked directly up to one of the skeletons and knelt next to the remains. His voice echoed low in the stone chamber as he spoke to the bones as if they were able to hear him. Pete talked about how he had searched for that place for decades, following leads and rumors, bribing people, and investigating every property Henry Thompson had ever owned. He was the grandson of one of the men killed in that chamber, one of the original members of the Blackwood gang who had been betrayed and executed by his own partners. Pete's grandfather had left hidden letters telling him about Blackwood's treasure and the final meeting that was planned. For years, Pete had believed that his grandfather had simply run off with a portion of the stolen money. Discovering the truth that he had been murdered in cold blood by men he trusted had consumed Pete's life with a thirst for revenge. Pete explained to his grandfather's bones that he had spent decades gaining the trust of the community, establishing his business, and patiently awaiting the opportunity to retrieve both the treasure and the revenge his family deserved. When Henry Thompson died, Pete knew he would finally get his chance. Bill remained hidden, barely daring to breathe, while Pete continued his macabre monologue. The man had followed Bill from day one, watching his every move, waiting for the right moment to act. He knew about the underground chambers because his grandfather had helped excavate them before he was betrayed. Pete got up and walked around the chamber, collecting personal effects from the skeletons. Rings, chains, anything that might have sentimental or monetary value. He talked about how he planned to use Blackwood's wealth to honor his grandfather's memory and punish the descendants of all those involved in the betrayal. It was then that Pete mentioned something that made Bill's blood run cold. He knew exactly who Bill was. Not only Henry Thompson's nephew, but the only living heir to the man who had helped kill his family. In Pete's twisted mind, Bill carried the guilt for his uncle's crimes and deserved to pay for them. Bill realized he had no choice. Pete would eventually find him hiding, and when that happened, he would join the skeletons in that shadowy chamber. With extreme care, he began to move through the darkness, trying to reach the entrance to the tunnel before Pete noticed his presence. But Pete had survived decades planning for that moment. His senses were heightened by the anticipation of revenge. When Bill stepped on a loose rock, the sound echoed through the chamber like a gunshot. Pete spun instantly, directing the flashlight in Bill's direction. The light revealed the older man's face, distorted by decades of hatred and obsession. He held an antique revolver in his free hand, the same weapon that had probably belonged to his grandfather. Pete spoke calmly about justice, about how some debts cross generations and must be paid with blood. He had waited all his adult life for this moment, and nothing would stop him from finally getting his revenge. Bill tried to argue, to explain that he had no knowledge of his uncle's crimes, who had discovered everything only a few days before. But Pete was beyond reason. His eyes shone with fanatical intensity as he described how Bill would die in the same way as the original traitors, alone in the darkness, abandoned by those he trusted. He had sealed the entrance to the tunnel after entering, ensuring that neither of them would make it out of that chamber alive. It was at that moment that a loud bark echoed through the tunnel. Rex had found a way to enter the underground chamber system, probably through some opening that Bill hadn't noticed. The sound distracted Pete for just a second, but it was long enough. Bill threw himself at the older man, fighting for control of the gun. The two men rolled across the bedrock floor of the chamber, Pete's flashlight spinning wildly and creating dancing shadows on the stone walls. The revolver fired once, the bullet ricocheting off the rocks and sending stone splinters flying through the air. Rex emerged from the tunnel as a force of nature, his protective instincts activated by the sound of conflict. The dog attacked Pete with lethal precision. His fangs finding the arm that held the weapon, Pete screamed in pain and let go of the revolver, which slid away across the uneven floor. Bill managed to extricate himself from the fight and ran towards the tunnel, Rex by his side. Behind them, Pete shouted threats and curses, his voice echoing through the underground chambers like the wails of the dead he had come to honor. The two ran through the first chamber and up the wooden stairs to the barn. Bill could hear Pete moving in the chambers below, looking for another exit or a way to move the rocks blocking the main tunnel. There was no time to hesitate. Bill rushed to his pickup, Rex jumping into the back. He drove directly to Cedar Ridge, his hands shaking on the steering wheel as he processed what had happened. Pete Garrison, the respectable man who knew the history of everyone in the region, was actually an obsessive avenger, willing to kill for crimes committed decades before Bill was born. In town, Bill went directly to the sheriff's station. He told his story to Sheriff Martinez, a younger man who had recently taken office. Martinez listened with increasingly grave expressions, taking notes and occasionally asking for clarification on specific details. The sheriff immediately organized an operation to return to the farm. A team of deputies and crime experts followed Bill back to the property, where they found abundant evidence to confirm his story. Pete Garrison had managed to escape the underground chambers, but he had left enough clues to his presence to validate Bill's account. The ensuing investigation revealed the full extent of Blackwood and Henry Thompson's scheme. The records found in the chambers allowed the law to finally close cases of theft that had remained unsolved for decades. Families of victims have finally gotten answers about the fate of their loved ones. Pete Garrison disappeared completely, leaving his abandoned market and no trace of where he had fled. Some said he had left for Mexico. Others believed he had died somewhere in the desert, consumed by the obsession that had dominated his life. Bill suspected that Pete was still out there, somewhere, plotting another way to get his twisted revenge. Bill decided to donate all the stolen wealth to a fund that would help the families of Blackwood's victims. He did not want to build his life on the blood of others. The farm, however, he kept. With Henry Thompson's legitimate small inheritance and hard work, he transformed the arid land into a productive place. Rex became her faithful partner, now free from the tension of the past, living as a farm dog. Bill sealed the underground chambers and planted a garden over them, trading dark secrets for new life. At night, under the Arizona sky, I reflected on choices. Henry had sought easy wealth, Pete, revenge. He chose redemption, to turn a curse into a blessing and to live honestly. The farm prospered, and the community came to respect him for his courage and integrity. When Rex died of old age, Bill buried him under the tree he had planted with a simple tombstone. Rex, the best companion a man can have. Thus, he understood that his true legacy was not wealth, but peace and hope. Samuel Blackwood's end came not by violence or revenge, but by one man's decision to do what was right. The land that has kept dark secrets has become a symbol of prosperity and redemption. If this journey has touched you, subscribe to the channel and follow other stories from the American wilderness.